I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see what we do with that. And just getting it into presenter mode. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, well, everybody, you know, when I was growing up, I learned some folk wisdom, which was that as you get older, years go faster. 2020 has failed to meet that. It has turned that around completely. So I want to ask you if in the chat you can just briefly say, how are you doing after the first 5,000 years of the pandemic? Because it does feel like it's lasting for absolutely ever. So maybe you can just put something into the chat and just say, how are you doing? Let's see, I can't see the chat from here, but maybe other people will. And maybe Richard, you can tell me what kinds of feedback people are sharing.
I will do that. There are a few. Can you see them now?
I can't actually, because it's difficult to access the chat from this presenter view window.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just kind of stop sharing for the time being and see the chat. Okay, here we go. Yes, kind of got used to it. Ears sore from wearing headphones. Yes, regrounded myself in land-based activities. Very wholesome thing to do. Yeah, few more. I just got used to working in my office. Could you imagine going back to anyone else's office? Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing that feedback. And you can send more if you want to later on. Okay. Now, this is what we have, an opportunity. The forcing hand of COVID-19 has opened an opportunity to trial online formats and to reinvent conferences as a core institution of research and practice. And this comes from an article which is entitled, "The Pandemic Push, Can COVID-19 Reinvent Conferences to Models Rooted in Sustainability, Equitability, and Inclusion?" This is the year of online conferences. And I took the question, are conferences changing, and just played with it a bit to get a number of reconfigurations. Why should face-to-face conferences change? Are face-to-face conferences changing? Are online conferences changing conferences? Are online conferences changing? And finally, will online conferences die after the pandemic? So let's start with a sense of the importance of conferences to academic culture from de Couper and Simons. And essentially, you don't have research communities and intellectual communities without conferences. And you also don't have those without an ecosystem of consultants and businesses who service and organize face-to-face conferences particularly, which are of varying usefulness to their target markets. But we have this observation from Raven and Ellsborg, which is that the conference seen as a forum for learning still pegs the learner in the role of passive receiver of information, that academic conferences are pretty static in some ways and change maybe slower than other kinds of conferences. But face-to-face conferences are changing, and dominant designs have always been contested. So Mill in 1970 talked about a 1960s countercultural kind of conference environment where there was a loose schedule, participants dropped in and out of events, information booths, rock bands, experiential activity, and participants who said the speakers had to come down from the stage to engage with them. Since 2000, we've seen the rise of the unconference, where the participants get together and determine the agenda together. Cigar writes about participatory conferences driven by peer learning. And there have also been a whole lot of new formats that surface in the facilitation and conference literature. Things like campfire sessions, birds of a feather, human spectrogram, lightning talks, Pecha Kucha, World Cafe, brain dates, etc. And then when you start talking about the bigger corporate conferences in particular, the Most Innovative Meetings of 2019 article by De Palma and Hoffman talks about different ways of creating immersive environments, like an app to make a whole city feel like an event venue, a supercomputer engaged in a live public debate with a human being, a YouTube ukulele star teaching lessons, a technology-equipped basketball court, and of course, physical spaces designed to make interaction very, very pleasant. But it does seem that much of this innovation is limited to the higher budget corporate conferences. When you get into the issues of designing face-to-face conferences, there are a number of balances which surface in the literature: the balance between formal and informal interaction, the balance between presentation and learning conversations, the balance between individual experiences and the temporary conference learning community. Lots of balances to try and get right, and you shift one and others may go off kilter. And then shifting to online conferences. Here we have a definition of online conferences from Anderson and Anderson, which I think is one of the best and one of the few books on online conferences that actually exists. Structured, time-delineated professional education event, organized and attended on the internet by a distributed population of presenters and participants who interact synchronously and or asynchronously. The most important thing to remember here in relation to the topic of the keynote is that online conferences were not invented in 2020, but they have been reinvented several times this year. Online conferences have been around for a very long time. Whoops, I just have to go back here. Can't actually see the back button on this, but I'll stay with this. They've been reinvented several times this year, but they've been around since 1984, when Lisa Kimball organized an online conference available to participants who were networked around a mainframe, dialing in, linking to other mainframes. Another early model was the email-based conference, as exemplified by the online distance education conference initiated by Terry Anderson in '92. This was for distance educators who couldn't make the travel for an annual face-to-face conference. But what we've seen since then has been increases in bandwidth, reductions in internet cost, improvements in processing power, and this has changed the technologies and form of online conferences. And resulted in online conferences that try to replicate a face-to-face conference with intense synchronous interaction over a few days. Lots of presentation after presentation. We see that here in mLearn as well, but thank goodness there's only one track. And there's also been a trend towards face-to-face conferences going hybrid. I can move on to the example of the Emerge online conferences, which I'd been involved in designing and organizing, with conferences in 2004, 2006, 2008, 2012, and 2018 about the use of educational technology in African higher education. Some of our core design principles were firstly social design and facilitation. The social design needs to drive the technology design. And the social design included a lot of flexibility and freedom for participants to initiate conversations, to have casual human conversation, and dedicated trained facilitators. Reflective space. We spaced our conference out over a period of about 2 weeks, with 3 days of discussion for each cluster of presentations to allow for reflective engagement in asynchronous conversation. There were multiple modes of engagement, which would be suitable for people with better and perhaps weaker internet connections, with a very strong emphasis on asynchronous, which gradually shifted more towards synchronous as bandwidth improved across the continent for our participants, mainly in higher education. And then customization of well-featured stable technology. Yeah, so we'd worked with a number of open source online education environments. We've worked with WordPress and BuddyPress, and currently the most recent environment we worked with was Sakai, an open source online learning environment. And then the design elements. The driver was linking global developments in African contexts and voices. The conference sometimes felt more like a festival than a conference. There was synchronous and asynchronous engagement, formal and informal interaction, scheduled and participant-initiated conversations, engagement in the conference and increasingly in social media as well. And then basic and advanced tools. Basic tools used for the kind of bread and butter interactions, advanced tools more for the kind of optional engagements and experiments where people who were perhaps less technology averse could go and explore and try new things out. Okay, moving on. Are online conferences changing conferences? Well, they have an advantage that they provide access. So what would be local could become global. They also reduce the carbon footprint significantly, not to zero, but negligible compared with the carbon footprint of a big international conference. And then the negatives are that you're still at home when you take part in an online conference. And there's a question about informal networking. And of course, you can be involved in either at the kind of victim end or the oppressor end, massacre by Zoom or Teams. And there seems to be a lot of that happening. My observation from dropping into several academic and more mainstream conferences is that an overwhelming focus on synchronous interaction may crowd out some reflective engagement, and that the use of the webinar rather than meeting formats can sometimes shut down community voices and interaction. I don't see that happening here because we have the safety valve of the Slack group as well. And then, if we can have emergency remote teaching, we can surely have emergency remote conferences. Yep, on the 1st of March, Science reported that the American Particle Physics Association had canceled their March meeting because they saw how bad things were going to get with the pandemic. They were expecting to get 11,000 people into Denver, and some people had already arrived. They canceled the meeting, and physicists did what physicists do. They self-organized. Some organized small meetings in Denver. Others organized using readily available tools and websites which they controlled to get an online conference going. Yeah. And then by the time of the April meeting, they'd self-organize even better. They got record attendance in the April meeting with hubs from 6 different continents. Maybe this is an unfair example because physicists are so good with technology and have so much experience with online conferences. Okay, let's move on. What's happened over the last couple of years has been the rise of new tools for conference networking. In response to the kind of critique of online conferences, which I've seen repeatedly in articles published in 2020, which is the problem with trying to get informal conversation and networking going of the kind that can be really fruitful for research collaboration and for career moves. There's been a lot of research, there've been a lot of product developments. Song, Riedel, and Maloney report on the development of the Mingler tool, which provides support for the kind of informal conversations that happen around the edges of in-person meetings. There have also been a lot of tools to structure the use of multiple Zoom spaces. The most notable of these, I think, is Keynote chat, and tools with a spatial metaphor with names like Hopin and spatial chat. Those have been some of the main ones. And of course, you have Remo, which has a spatial metaphor with rooms and with seating arrangements, and you can move around between them. And this is a screen grab from the Mingler tool. Yeah, a brief tale of 3 online conferences. I've deliberately ignored the mainstream scholarly conferences because what I've generally found in the down the line academic conferences is a very conservative approach, which doesn't show us a lot of possibilities for the ways forward. It's mostly been, you know, we do our Zoom or we do our Teams, and we might have an asynchronous environment paired with that, and we might have a bit of chat. That's been about it. Okay, so one example is the UCT Teaching and Learning Conference. First time we took our Teaching and Learning Conference at University of Cape Town online. We had months of conceptual planning and trying to figure out when the conference would be in an unstable calendar, and then less than a month from the call for abstracts to pull the conference together. Fortunately, there were a bunch of us in the team who had experience with online conferences, or were even trained online facilitators through the Emerge Africa project. And we had our Zoom licenses from emergency remote teaching as well. So we used a Sakai site template that we'd used for an Emerge online conference in 2018, coupled that with Zoom, and attracted more participation in terms of numbers of people logging on from our own institution than in our previous conventional teaching and learning conference. Also found ourselves getting a lot of interest from colleagues in other parts of Africa and in other continents. We weren't trying for that. It's just that some of my colleagues just reflexively tweet stuff out. And our local conference became an international conference. We also did things a bit differently with our conference. On 2 of the openings in the mornings, we had a dance lecturer leading people in jazz art chair dance. And we also had, you know, a couple of slots available for informal networking and some escape room type puzzles available to people in the conference site. I think a lot of people like that stuff. Okay, then a participant-driven event, the Future of Work 24-hour global gathering, which was a project of the open space community, and really quite instructional for people who don't know open space. They set out essentially a 3.5-hour block where you would actually get together and you'd have an opening circle where people would nominate topics. Those topics would then be decided on and scheduled between the rooms. And you'd move from one meeting to another according to the schedule or according to your own inclination, because you could, it's open space. And then at the end, a share out to gather feedback and insight from the smaller meetings. Among the things that they had was a room for tech support. They had a room where you could see the conference visuals, graphic recordings. There was a networking room, the Mingle and Flutter room, and there was also a groundhog room for people who just wanted some solitude and could just listen to some calming music. This attracted about 216 people in total across every continent. And then a mega event, the Embodiment Conference. And that conference got probably about 485,000 registrations, over 200,000 people accessing events across hundreds of events. You'd expect each event, many events got thousands of participants, But what happened is that they both scaled up and scaled down, because the large scale of this conference was coupled with the access to coffee breaks where you could be in a conversation with 5 or 10 people. You could join the Facebook group. There were local Facebook groups. And some of the presenters actually asked for participants to come and join them on the panel so they could actually see human faces and know that they were engaging with human beings. Okay, and just a reminder of how this stacks up from the point of view of disabled people who've always had a problem with face-to-face conferences. Able people know we can't do remote conferences, it's so hard. And then this conversation where coronavirus is high and able people say, we're pleased to announce our new remote conferencing system. And then really the closing question here, will online conferences die after the pandemic? And I don't know about you, but sometimes I find myself longing for face-to-face conferences, for the actual eye contact with people, for the possibility of having tea or a meal together, for something simple like a handshake, or even occasionally, a collegial hug. These things do not happen at online conferences. A quote from Ruas et al., who reported from a series of conferences about computational chemistry. We see now either virtual conferences or in-person meetings. However, for the future, it might be desirable to work towards a hybrid online/in-person format. This will reduce pressure from environmental and availability factors, and it won't impair social networks. So that essentially is where somebody steeped in online conferences heads. And then there's a question I want to ask you, which is, what will you do after the pandemic? Your options. I will never attend another online conference. I will attend online and face-to-face conferences, or I'll only attend online conferences. The URL is here, but I'd like to ask if some helpful person could actually put the URL into the chat as well. And I'd love to see your answers to this question, to this poll. I'm going to stop screen sharing now, so I can actually go and share the screen with the answers to this question, with the poll on it. Let's see, fast poll. Let's see if I can share that one. I'm going to go back to that. Just see if we've got any answers to this. No, seriously, no votes at the moment. Yes, they've actually gone and logged me out. It's going to log into this again without showing you my password or anything. Let's see if I got this up. That is a problem. Just getting into this now. They don't seem to like this one. I'll try once more.
The URL was posted in chat.
It was posted in chat. Thank you very much. Yes. I will get there. And I'll try once more. Okay, this doesn't seem to actually want me in, so it's a mystery, and I will actually solve this problem and give the answer back to people in the Slack later on. But let's get back within the room and look at some questions here.
Yes, please use the Q&A app in Zoom.
Okay, I'm just trying to separate this out from questions from the previous one. Okay. Oh, so Ramesh has got the results of that already. That's good. And we can actually share those results. Okay. Mark, do you have key lessons for time-limited organizers? Part of a team that organizes a small university conference. We've become accidentally international. We will still want to stay small. Encouraging tips beyond the lecture format. My suggestion to you is space things out, go asynchronous as well. The moment you start actually flooding people with lectures, it becomes impossible to have the kind of expansive and reflective thinking that you may want to encourage. You may also want to switch the balance from lectures to having a number of workshops as well, which are inherently perhaps, they don't scale well beyond perhaps 50 to 100, depending on the design of the workshop, and require a little bit more commitment than somebody just dropping in. You may even decide that you want to limit some of your workshops just to members of your organization. That's what we did with one of our workshops. Okay, and any other questions or comments at this point? Okay, and there are results up there. That's interesting. I was going to have a look at those results. And the results are 100% I will attend online and face-to-face conferences. Why am I not surprised? I think there may be fewer online conferences after 2020, but a lot more people actually know the format and are familiar with online conferences. This is not going to be the end of online conferences. But I don't think online conferences have really done enough to change conferences yet. And there's going to be a need for a lot more experimentation and exploration in different kinds of conference design. I think that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. For the next keynote, we have